All right, welcome everyone to TableTalk RPG Episode 3. Joining us this week is TTRPG writer and editor Anna Goldberg.
Hello.
Anna, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah. Here on TableTalk, we cover everything related to Andrews McNeil's publishing slate, but we kind of like to go a little bit beyond just that and talk about larger themes and larger elements in the TTRPG community, in gaming, and everything from mechanics all the way down to writing and art. We're really excited to have you this week in particular because a lot of the work that you've done in particular with Zweihander is of a lot of interest. So just to begin with, I would love to hear from you just a little bit about how you got into the world of TTRPGs.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I growing up in the South with a very satanic panic environment didn't actually wind up getting into playing TTRPGs until I left home and I went to college because that was just seen as something that was, not done. And as soon as I realized it was just, like rolling dice using your imagination, I was completely hooked. Had a bit of a hiatus there in college and then moving out to Seattle, which is where I live now. Started playing with friends, and then this really kicked into high gear in 2020 with the pandemic because I was just spending a lot of time at home. And that was actually when I played Zweihander for the first time, was with a friend that I had met through streaming on the Old Encounter Roleplay channel. And that was my introduction to the the wider world of the Andrews McNeil games and RPGs and whatnot.
That's really, really cool. Did you end up playing, was Dungeons and Dragons kind of your first introduction, or was Zweihander just off the bat one of the
It
first
was actually Pathfinder for me that I started playing in
things?
college, Pathfinder 1E, and then I played 5th edition D&D with a group of friends in person here in Seattle. And then when we put that group, on pause because of the pandemic, we were like, let's just be safe rather than sorry. And it was really then that I, expanded my TTRPGs beyond just those typical D20 systems that I think most people are familiar with or most people start with. So it was like the Zweihander system, and then around the time that I started playing that, I got really into Powered by the Apocalypse games, and then from there, there's just so many other non 5e, non Pathfinder games out there. I've got an entire bookshelf in my house just dedicated to that.
That's excellent. Those are the best shelves to have.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in talking to you today a little bit about something that Zweihander has built into it, which is something that we've seen being developed overall in the TTRPG community, with Dungeons and Dragons especially, over the past couple years. But it's really something that's taking tabletop as a precedent, and something that is really changing the dynamics of places like game stores and that have been kind of traditional bastions of what I kind of mentally refer to as 1A behavior. So something that is really just kind of baked in from the get-go with Zweihander in particular is the notion of accessibility and safety tools.
Right.
There's a lot kind of pre-built into character creation that has to deal with expression, that has to deal with being sure that everybody in a session is clearly communicating not only their own boundaries, but making sure it's freely accessible to be able to discuss those things. Was that the case when you were first getting into TTRPGs? I know everybody has kind of their own horror stories, unfortunately. There's plenty of reason, and we don't need to share or go through all of that necessarily.
Sure.
We've definitely all experienced it, but in Zweihander in particular, let's start just with the basics of character creation.
Sure.
When you look at your own contributions into Zweihander, what would you say is, in the past several years, kind of the most important development as far as TTRPGs go when it comes to building a more inclusive and a more safe and welcoming environment for kind of not only the old guard players, but people who are new or people who are maybe encountering these things for the first time?
For sure. I think my answer to this is a little bit two-pronged. But to begin with, you asked about safety tools previously. It wasn't until 2020 when I started playing games that were live streamed that I even really learned what safety tools were and what they were about. That was just not really something that I don't think any of us, just playing as friend groups were aware of or knew about. And so sometimes, when that sort of stuff, things would come up that would be, adjudicated kind of on an ad hoc basis. And it wasn't because, people didn't care about safety around the table, although some people certainly didn't. I think it was just not really part of the baseline or part of the, what we call table expectations or table culture or anything like that. But now that I, got into live streaming games, especially like playing with a lot of strangers that you might not know. Or back when I used to GM, I was almost exclusively a convention GM for the longest time. So even though I wasn't aware of a ton of different safety tools, I would always like have a check-in with my players before we started and basically, go over a safety tool briefing with them. And now that's become like an essential part of not just tables that I play at, but also like my own philosophy informing game design. So to answer your question about like what in my specific work at Zweihander has contributed to that like shift in broader TTRPG culture, first off was getting to work with Kate Bullock on the Touch the Darkness tools. That's like a free safety tool set that you can download, I know, off of Drive-Thru RPG that is designed to work with all of the Zweihander games. Getting to work on that was absolutely amazing. Like Kate designed it, and I had some input on that, had some editorial work that I did on that as well. But I think that it's a really great introduction to setting the stage for this, whether you are a really seasoned gamer, whether you have ever played the system before or not. And I mean, when I introduce a lot of people to Zweihander, some of them get a little bit like, oh, because of the the size of the rule game. It looks very complicated, and in some ways it can be. But I like to try and like walk people through a more straightforward way of doing it. And they're like, okay, I see how this is. And Touch the Darkness is designed to be a great part of that process. So that for sure. And then not from an explicit safety tools perspective, but when I was working on Flames of Freedom and we were revising and drafting stuff for the like guide to, life in the 13 colonies, the sort of world building that you put out that's, not just game mechanics, but what is the world like in the American Revolutionary War time period. That's actually where my academic background is. I did a graduate student fellowship in early American literature, gender, and sexuality. So a lot of my expertise in that really informed the way that we wrote and changed that section of the book, because it does have it can tend towards, in historical gaming, it can tend towards a lot of focus on like, dudes with guns running around and shooting people. And because it is a role-playing game and you have such a wide variety of professions and options for your character to be, it was really important to make sure that we showed like a really well-rounded picture of what life was like during this time period as well as we could. And just give people the options to live in a fully realized world that goes beyond the I'm role playing a like stereotypical, militiaman martial character or something like that. So having that built into the like world building of it was really important to me, and I think actually does a lot of work to make the table space more inclusive. So it's a good question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a real kind of false dichotomy that is ascribed to accessibility.
Yeah.
In a lot of titles. And across the TTRPG world. And I think the reality of it is it really does make it efforts to make things more inclusive and more representative definitely make it so there are more possibilities. It creates a more fleshed out world because people exist.
What?
In
Yeah.
reality, and it's a little bit of a strange thing to have your imagination extend far enough to a satanic Freemason cult running early America with a giant apple, but there's nobody queer.
Mm-hmm.
That's something I would like to ask you to expand upon a little bit too, with the Zweihander system in particular. Initially, Grim and Perilous is in that subheading, and it is very much a world based in horror and based in things that can be, there's gore. It's viscerally upsetting, those monsters, and that's something that kind of carries across a lot of gaming spaces too. And I think that there's another kind of false dichotomy that people set up in their heads, which is the safety tools are inherently counterintuitive to experiences in horror or experiences in environments that might be threatening or upsetting. And I think the reality is that there really isn't a conflict between those. It's simply allowing people to explore them a little bit more easily. Is that something you could expand upon a little bit?
Yeah, I agree. I think that sometimes the setting up of that conflict is just that people are not necessarily used to having that type of conversation out in the open, certainly not around the gaming table. I mean, like I was one of those people before, like when I started playing role-playing games, and I never had a conversation with my friends beforehand about, things that I didn't want to have come up in games. So like not only is it respectful to just like have that conversation with other people, not just when you're playing with strangers, but like also when you're playing with your friends. You just want everybody to have fun and have a good time. And kind of what I like about it, what I love about horror too, is just that part of the experience and part of the fun of horror is kind of like going straight up to that line of the thing that you're just like, I don't want to like cross over this line, but I like to get close enough to it where it just scares me a little without sending me completely over the edge. And like safety tools are just a really good way to do that. I kind of see it as akin to the way that like a storyteller, a cinematographer, somebody like that does like a fake out or whatnot in a horror movie. It's just another type of like storytelling techniques that keeps the horror like delicious spine shivers without getting to something that can be triggering to somebody in real life. And I think like it also just respects people's like privacy and autonomy to just be like, hey, this is off the table and we're not going to make a big deal about it. We're not going to say, oh, it's because this is off the table because Sammy is afraid of spiders or something. We just all have that expectation going in. And I think it makes people just feel more comfortable to explore, you know, the narrative possibilities there.
I think one of the best analogies that I've heard for it really is uh, just in the name itself. And it's interesting that you mentioned that the idea of kind of walking up to something without having to be fully immersed in it. Because this analogy that I've heard before is that it can really serve as like a lap belt on a roller coaster.
Right.
Because you're still experiencing really you're still getting whipped around at 60 miles an hour, but you're not like flying out of the car. The car's not moving the track. There's not a fiery explosive mayhem everywhere.
That's a really good analogy. I like that a lot.
Yeah, but you're still getting that adrenaline.
Mm-hmm.
I think it also interestingly opens up the conversation for allowing people to talk about what they're afraid of and allowing people who are game runners and writers to take those fears and to explore them in a way that can be really, really fun and really, really frightening, but also really, really constructive.
Yeah, I agree. I think that they're just to like add on to that a little bit. I think that some of the, you know, backlash against using safety tools at the table, not that I'm really, you know, entertaining that at all because I use them at all of my tables and I will continue to use them. Is just that people see that as being something you know, rigid and inflexible and prescribing what they can't do. And they're just like, well, that's not fun. I don't want to sit down at a game table and be told I can't do this and can't do that. But in reality, safety tools are something that are, you know, breathing and flexible along with the players at the table. And it just, you know, allows for a greater flexibility in storytelling and role play. And yeah, I think that, you know, shift in perspective of what safety tools actually are, what you can accomplish with them and the kind of fun that you can have makes it seem less like, you know, someone is finger wagging at you for not following rules.
I think it's definitely a repositioning of it. It's something that opens possibilities rather than limits them.
Yes.
I wonder if you could tell me a little bit more, in particular, when it comes to Zweihander and when it comes to Flames of Freedom. I'm going to pivot the conversation here just a little bit from safety tools and really start talking about representation in gaming a little bit and talk about, especially the world of 1776. Your expertise is really, really fascinating, and your background especially, and what you were able to bring to Flames of Freedom. Overall, when you look at the world of 1776 in Flames of Freedom, what would you say is, to begin with, kind of the number one thing that you brought from your background and maybe a reality of early America that people might not realize or might not think in terms of, people were exactly this way then. That's present in the book. That's absolutely not fictional.
Yeah, I feel like my favorite sort of example of this is that like with this, you know, guide to colonial life, I really had the opportunity to shine a spotlight on some particular like queer and transgender, or what we might nowadays call transgender. You know, that language has evolved. That word didn't really exist back then, but people who kind of defied traditional gender roles and gender expressions certainly did. So for me, it was great in particular to put specific examples of queer and trans people in the books, like Robert Shirtliff, who was first and only actually person. Oh, sorry. What was that?
Oh, no, I didn't see.
I just heard like a background thing. It might have been me echoing. But yeah, they were somebody that served in the Continental Army and successfully sued for a pension afterwards, and they were a transgender man. And I think that it was just really cool to like make sure that that got put in the book because this was a real historical person who was assigned female at birth, lived as a man, you know, fought for his country in the Revolutionary War and successfully got a pension. You know, just a person living their life in that period of history, and a lot of people don't even know his name. And I just thought that it was a really cool opportunity to get to put in some specific examples of queer and trans people from that period, because the documentation is a little bit like thin on the ground, partially because, this was a different time period, and the types of print material in which you're likely to encounter something like this is usually more like court documents or legal documents or something. Not exactly riveting reading, but because of my interest in that and like my background in archival work, being able to translate that into a more popular format like a role-playing game is just really great to me. I think is a really good example of that like academic outreach that I've always wanted to do.
I think it speaks to something that we spoke about a little bit earlier, which is the kind of the advance and the inclusion of representation in these settings in particular. It really made them more realistic.
Yes.
It's fleshing out the reality that existed then and that kind of exists all around us, rather than a piece of writing from a singular perspective. Especially when it comes to queer and trans individuals, which historically, the one that came to mind immediately. This came up in a recent session of mine. I was playing a character based on Jerry, who was a trans man in the 1800s, who was actually second to the royal surgeon to Elizabeth. And he pioneered the C-section. He lived his entire life as a man. He was an incredible doctor. And when he died and they did his autopsy, all of his friends made sure that his records were under his name that he had chosen. They made sure that his epitaph was that way. They threatened viciously to sue anyone who would say anything else. So we were doing this Victorian London setting, and so he's who I've been playing, and it's been incredibly fun. But I think really something I think is so fantastic is there are so many of these examples of people who lived their entire lives very, very genuinely. And seemingly historically, in many contexts, even in periods like Victorian England, which is famously socially repressed, 1776, which is just socioeconomically everywhere, that people were strangely, in some ways, almost either more accepting or simply they had never encountered someone like this before, and so when they met them, they were like, "Oh yes, of course, this is who you are."
Right. Yeah, there was this brings to mind something that I worked on in my graduate work was a series of just different different Puritan court documents. Again, not exactly the kind of like riveting that most people are going to seek out, but a fair number of them that were brought forward, during this Puritan era, which a lot of people, and rightfully so, have this image in their minds of the Puritans as being this very sort of repressive culture to live under, and in many ways they were. But in some of these court documents, you'll see instances of something like, oh, there are these two young boys who are like hired hands, and we caught them like sleeping together and engaging in sexual intercourse in a hayloft in the barn of like one of the guys who employs them. And they're like, well, technically they didn't do anything to break any law we can think of on the books. This is just unusual, and we don't know what to do. So I guess we'll just write this legal memo and tell them to like get back to work and quit fooling around. And it's just like, you don't expect to see that in like Puritan England or Puritan Massachusetts court documents, but there it is. And I'm just like, yeah, it's different. It's different from what you'd expect for sure.
Can you tell us a little bit more about some of those documents in particular that made it, or some of the inspirations from them that made it into Flames of Freedom? Because I know that you keep saying that it's not the most interesting reading for most people, but like, I'm super about it. Like the fact that the entirety of like The Witch was based on Puritan court documents.
Oh yeah,
I love that kind of stuff.
So that's actually a great pivot, because I remember when I was talking with Dan Fox as we were, working on writing out particularly the the alchemist handbook. I'm forgetting what the magic spells chapter is called. It is a lot of but anyway, the magic spells era and like the fleshing out of the colonial horror and folk tales and things like that. And he said, we want to like write this as if it is one of Cotton Mather's fever dreams. So a lot of my experience like reading these Puritan religious tracts and these kind of fire and brimstone sermons, I got to incorporate into a really cool and interesting way where we got to build, monsters and scary adventures and things based off of what they saw as a very, real existential threat to their beliefs and their way of life. And, the witch in particular is, what if all of the Puritans' like worst nightmares about the dangers of, Satan and all these other things in the world were literally true. And because it's a movie, you can do that. And with Flames of Freedom, because it is a game in which, folklore and magic and all of those things really exist, in a different way than, stories exist in our world, we can do that. We can make those things real. So that was sort of a fun exercise for me that I did in an unexpected way.
That's really, really cool that you mentioned that. I really love the Alchemist Notebook section.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a cool part of it. And as you say that, I can see bits and pieces of it that definitely draw on that and that have that motivation of very metaphysical things being real and impacting daily life.
Mm-hmm.
And it definitely feels like you're reading the Foehammer, or like you're reading Travels Over the Invisible World, or any of those.
Well, that makes me really glad to hear, because I wrote most of the flavor text for the spells, like the little italicized things. So I'm really happy to hear that came across. I was very proud of that work.
Fantastic, yeah. I would love to use that in particular and pivot it slightly to another question, which is when it comes to Flames of Freedom in particular. Obviously, the setting is incredibly rife for exploration. It's incredibly rife for horror. It's incredibly rife for just building a really, really fun game with. But I think it's also a great tool to spark interest in history, especially around this period. Could you speak a little bit to games as educational tools, or to Flames of Freedom in particular, but beyond it, an immersive way to really build interest, especially in younger people?
Yeah, I think that, with Flames of Freedom and with the other, games and properties and things that I've worked on, I've never worked on anything that, was specifically designed for an educational, like this is not a game that is meant to teach you about the American Revolution in the same way that like listening to a lecture or a history podcast or something like that is. But I think that we have, as creative writers and artists and, all the various different talented types of people that work on these things have a really good opportunity to spark that itch for people. So as much of my sort of factual expertise that I can put in there to basically try and get people's attention and be like, oh, to use a previous example, like Robert Shirtliff, I've never heard of this person before. There's a fantastic, bibliography that we have in the back of the book that also is where all of the various citations and things come from, and the types of stuff that you can read if you want to learn more. And that just makes me really happy. That's something that people that they don't stop with the game. If they're really interested in it, they can go out and, do the reading for themselves or investigate the sources for themselves. And, that's something that I do if I ever, plan out adventures and things that I'm writing in that setting. I'm still learning new things about this era all the time. And so for sure, it's a great way to just ignite the imagination and get that enthusiasm for going out and learning more sparked.
It's an excellent thing for those of us who are footnotes enthusiasts.
Yep.
It's so cool. I'm gonna go for some more Flames of Freedom specific questions here. They're a little bit less broad, so okay. These are a little bit more fun. Not that these all haven't been incredibly fun. So there are so many incredible creatures that inhabit this world, and so many that are built on folklore that draws from such a variety of cultures across early America, and with the contributing slate of writers who come from a variety of both cultural and interpersonal backgrounds. There's a real kind of diversity of folklore when it comes to the creatures that one can encounter in the world of 1776 and Flames of Freedom. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about some of the monsters that might be your favorite, or if in the research for this book, if you ran across any creatures or pieces of folklore that really stood out to you.
Yeah, that happened several times actually, because at least with the monsters, I didn't do as much work on, writing those directly, but because I had to make so many editorial passes over them, I got, pretty well acquainted with things. And after a while, there were a few times I'd look at this and go, hey, have I noticed this before in the story, or is this completely made up for this book? And more often than not, there's at the very least like a seed of something, whether it's from a popular culture conception of something like a ghoul or a vampire, to some things that are way more culturally specific. Like, for example, I know Justin, who's my GM for the streamed Flames of Freedom game that I play, is in here, and he put the knockers in our stream game of Flames of Freedom, and that's actually something that is folklore from like my family's culture. They're like these little creatures that make strange knocking noises and like steal your things, and they particularly have significance among like Welsh coal miners, which is part of my family background. And they were known to make these knocking noises to like warn the miners of poisonous gas or, sudden cave-ins about to happen. So they were kind of seen as these a little bit mischievous, but also sometimes helpful spirits that just kind of coexisted with humanity. And it's always really cool to see something that's really culturally specific like that in the book, particularly when it's given that specificity in context of, people that we have like a great agglomeration of cultures represented in the book as existed in history at the time. So it's great to also see that reflected in the monsters section or the creature section as well.
Definitely, and it's something that I love about the book in particular. I have been a folklore head since I was a little kid.
Me too. Yeah, it was like the monster manual is the modern outgrowth of those like dragonology books. The ones that look like the wizard tomes, and I'm obsessed with that kind of thing.
Yeah, as a little kid, I definitely wanted to have my own medieval bestiary of all the creatures.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, absolutely. I would like to expand on the folklore aspect of it a little bit more, just because so much of what folklore is either serves as cautionary tales in many cases, or is moral lessons in different ways. And this is something that I would really be interested in hearing a little bit more, especially with your expertise and with your background. But in kind of some of your editorial passes in the flash fictions and in the flavor text that you, were there any sources or kind of themes across folklore or across storytelling in early America or in some of these early documents that really made it into your writing? Are there things or are there themes or archetypes that really transcended across these kind of early Puritan periods to 1776 that inspired you or that you wanted to include?
I am really glad that you asked that question, because I think that, with this sort of common theme of all of these different, creatures and folklores and stories and rumors, like all the adventure hooks that we have that are specific to each of the 13 colonies, really just drove home to me how much these folklores and these stories are just humanity's attempts to reconcile things that they don't fully understand with the reality that we're living in. And I find that such a fruitful and fertile ground for telling stories. So when we wrote those adventure hooks, half the fun of writing a TTRPG book is the stuff that you leave out and the questions that you pose unanswered. Because at the end of the day, you're not writing a novel and you're not writing a textbook. You're writing, writing a toolbox for people to go play with and make their own things and, pursue their own story seeds. And being able to do that, not just with, with the monster manual specifically, but I'm also thinking of the maps and the locations and the fact that many of these folklores and legends have persisted today, such that everybody understands and knows like what the Jersey Devil is all about. And I think that's a really great way, like these folklores and these stories are a great way to connect the past and the present with this rich history and culture and just fodder for amazing storytelling that modern day people can relate to, even if it's, we don't understand those folklores in the same way that, people in 1776 were thinking about them. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know it was a little bit of an open-ended answer, but that's the beauty of it.
Yeah, no, that was a fantastic response. I think it's really, really fascinating how this goes back to talking about those kind of puritanical judiciary documents, but it's really, really fascinating how folklore and how kind of archetypes around it evolve out of things that are built into the literal lives of people. When you look at something like the Jersey Devil, that it's something that is by description something very absurd, to modern people. But if you go to the Pine Barrens in Jersey and you walk around, you think, it could probably be here. If I'm here in the early half of the 1700s, and I'm standing in the middle of the Pine Barrens and there's nothing here. And somebody is telling me that this creature is out here, I'm gonna keep an eye out for it.
Yeah, I mean, story is just what's in those empty gaps that are left by, fear and wondering and excitement and suspense. So to me, it's no wonder that like something that seems very fanciful would come out of that, especially because, and I just want to talk about the Jersey Devil for a little bit, because this is a really fascinating piece of American folklore for me. This might sound like a digression, but I promise.
Not at all.
I'm gonna rally it all back, right? So like there's a lot of different alternate stories about the origin of the Jersey Devil and like how such a creature was made. And they're all some version of the sort of monstrous birth myth that people at the time basically used to explain anybody who was born that looked like physically different from like a perceived norm. And living in a time when childbirth is extremely dangerous, both parental and infant mortality is so high, and in a culture that is almost obsessive, maybe not almost, maybe just obsessive in its attempt to control like reproduction and, reproductive bodies and whatnot. There come all of these books and stories and things of like, here is what causes certain types of, monstrous births. Like people say things like kids with red hair were born that way because they were conceived while the parent was on their period, or this kid that has like a different shaped nose looks that way because the mother saw a pig like while she was pregnant. And so this is something that we now have, we understand that that's not the way that this works, and we hopefully understand some of the really like ableist assumptions that go along with this. But the fact that there are all of these stories of these hybrid human and animal creatures and things like that in a time when these anxieties are really at the forefront of the culture, it's like you can see where that comes from. And even though nowadays we have such a different relationship to it, for people living back then, this was an incarnation of a very real fear, very real like not understanding the way that the world works and trying to explain that fear with something else.
That's something that I'm really myself really interested in particular. My own background and my own field of interest is in medical history.
Oh, wow. We're going to have to talk more about that after this then, because that's awesome.
Absolutely. Thank you. Something that is really, really fascinating to me, and that evolves out of kind of Europe during the Middle Ages and then kind of progresses forward, is kind of the notion and the perception of that are intractable to humans, things that we don't have control over. And a large part of that has to do with things like childbirth and things like information and things that are otherwise indescribable. And the Jersey Devil is a great one. There's a fantastic paper. I'm going to have to try and find it to send you. It's a really brief tangent. It's a forensic pathologist going back and trying to determine various syndromes that were responsible for descriptions of local legends.
Yes, I would love to read this. Please send it.
Absolutely.
And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's something that's fascinating that carries to Flames of Freedom in particular, is even the villains in Flames of Freedom, a lot of their motivations come from not necessarily a lack of understanding, but an establishment of control over a world that is very new and very, very chaotic. And as you see all the different factions kind of colliding in Flames of Freedom, you find yourself kind of not necessarily in a moral gray area, because there's some real villains. But I think it almost gives us an opportunity to understand the motivations of people in early America, and especially the motivations of people who are often overlooked by historical documentation or by representation. Can you speak a little bit to kind of the efforts in particular in Flames of Freedom that went into kind of the portrayal of not only a diverse cast of heroes and protagonists, but also a villain?
Yeah, I think okay, first of all, like one of my favorite things about this, and I have to bring this up because as a disabled person myself, one of my least favorite villain tropes is like the villain that is evil because they are disabled. So like when the classic is the James Bond villain where like that they're evil because they're missing an eye or they have a scar on their face or something like that. And that doesn't really happen in Flames of Freedom because it's kind of built into the game book itself that this is a time and a place where a lot of people like sustain life-altering injuries, or as in our modern days also are like born with various disabilities and things. And because that's just something that's like accepted as part of life and character creation and things like that, we fall less into those kind of cliched pitfall things there. What I love about the design of particularly our villains, and even some of the characters that are like allied with the parties, like Grace of Beers from Boston Besiege, the adventure in the back of the book comes to mind, is that we give them the sort of room to be complex and the room to breathe. So you may, especially with all of the different layers that we have of like culture and background and allegiance and all of these different things intersecting, your party may find themselves, politically agreeing with somebody that, is also fighting for the side of the revolution, but is doing something, absolutely morally reprehensible in order to advance that political cause. We ran into that in the streamed game that we were doing, and Justin did a fantastic job of like having us solve this folklore mystery that turned out to be, a guy that was putting a bunch of young girls in danger, and he was saying this is for the sake of the revolution, and our group was like, well, no, you need to quit doing that. So I think having the allies and the villains kind of embody these different conflicting ideologies and not falling into the desire to give things easy answers. That's hard, especially when you're telling a story and especially when you're creating characters. Especially, how many times in a row can I say the word especially? But given that a lot of people's experience with tabletop role playing games to begin with can be in this very morally black and white, like broad strokes of heroism thing, just kind of keeping keeping the villains as just selfish humans at the end of the day does a whole lot, I think, to make these stories really interesting, and also I think to make the horror that much more horrifying when it does come up.
Mm-hmm. I really like something you said there, which is it allows room for greater complexity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that goes really across everything that we've talked about today.
Yeah.
I think everything that's built into Flames of Freedom, the things that are now hardwired into the Swihunter system, and that we're seeing increasingly across TTRPGs, both in terms of safety tools, in terms of the increase of proper representation and storytelling, and in the accessibility of character. And I think that's something that all of those really tie together to allow for greater complexity. And as somebody who loves having my big shelf full of TTRPG books and phone books, I can say that I really, really love having them be complex. And I think that for even if somebody's a little bit hesitant, I think that's probably an incredibly good selling point.
Well, thank you.
I'm sorry, your imagination's going to be bigger. You can do more with your imagination now.
Yeah, I think that it's just really great to be a part of something that I see as like a big shift happening in the culture of the way that we talk about, representation more broadly. And yeah, just kind of creating these characters that are complex and resist easy answers is just really important towards advancing that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. We have got just about 15 minutes overall left in the hour here. Is there anything in particular that you would like to tell our audience before we open up the floor for questions a little bit?
Oh my gosh. Well, first of all, thank you for being here and listening. I did not realize that we had been going for 45 minutes already. That seemed
That's why
a lot quicker than it actually was. So thank you. Thank you so much for your interest in the games. I hope that, whether you have played them or not, that you have been able to find a piece of yourself represented in the book, and that you have been able to make characters and make worlds that are fun, that are inclusive, that are grim and perilous, or like my friends and I say, grim, perilous, and thirsty for some of our games, for sure. And I just thank you for playing the games and for getting your friends involved. And yeah, I hope that you see yourself represented in them too.
That is absolutely our hope for absolutely everything that we do. Well, we're going to open up the floor to questions for the last little bit here. Everybody who's joined us, you have a little option down at the bottom to raise a hand if you'd like to ask a question. I know that Dana Fox is in here. I can see him potentially asking a question.
I was like, I actually know everyone here. Thanks, guys.
All right. It takes just a second on Spaces to get requests.
No worries. I assumed it was some kind of a delay.
No worries at all. If anybody else would like to, I'm just sending out quick little speak invites. There you go. All right. Well, I think we might have just covered everything so thoroughly in this episode that we haven't really left a lot of room for questions. This has been an incredibly great conversation. We've covered so much in this time that we've had, and I really, really appreciate you joining us and really, really giving such a richness and a depth and a background to Flames of Freedom that I think not only explains so much about what is awesome about it as a book, but also is incredibly intriguing for anybody who might not be familiar or who's interested in the dark and intriguing world of 76 that you can encounter in Flames of Freedom from Andrews McMeel Publishing. We'll just allow about 30 more seconds here if anybody wants to raise a hand, and then we will wrap up if that's good.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Come on, no. Well, all of you have some burning questions. I mean, I've got some more. I can toss out one more.
For sure.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite character in Flames of Freedom that's included in the manual?
Oh, that's included in there, or that I made?
Oh, that you made. Okay, we'll do both. We'll say one that's included and one that you made.
Okay, when that's included, I'm not going to say Grace De Beers, even though that would be, potentially among my favorites because she's just absolutely incredible. But it's the fella that is the Sin Eater, the Quaker man who's the Sin Eater in the preamble adventure to Boston Besiege. So it's designed to be played as a one shot. And the concept of a Sin Eater is just this really bizarre sort of itinerant person traveling around who's basically offering to ritually eat the sins and transgressions of all of the people around them so that those people will not have to suffer damnation for something like that. And that guy is just a very strange, very complex, I know like morally gray is kind of overused as a term now, but just a very morally conflicted and complex character. And it's like you'll want to help him, but he also might have some more nefarious things up his sleeve. So he was a great NPC. I didn't actually work on creating that character, but I did edit the adventure. My favorite Flames of Freedom character that I've made is the one that I play on stream. She is a bod, and her name is Contentment Hussy. This is actually a character that is based off of a real ancestor of mine whose real name was Contentment Hussy and, lived in colonial America. My dad told me about this person and I was like, excuse me, what? Do we have documents? And there's really not a lot that we know about her life. She shows up mainly in legal documents like her father's will and property deeds. So I decided that I would take this, character who is an ancestor of mine and kind of fill in the blanks and imagine what her life might have been like since we just don't really have any documentation of what it was. And I have gotten to play her for several months now, and we're just about to start back up with our third season on Monday. So I can't wait to embody her again. She's recently she's recently entered the advanced tier and become an informant. So we're gonna have a lot of fun with Washington's Culper Ring and doing cool spy stuff next time.
Fantastic. I will be on the lookout for that in the coming season. All right. I think that is about it that we have today. Thank you, Anna Goldberg, again so much for joining us for
Thank you.
TableTalk RPG. We'll be looking forward to more Flames of this upcoming season, and anybody who would like to get in on the phone of 1776 can snag a copy of Flames of Freedom wherever TTRPG books are sold. Thank you again, also, everybody who joined us in to listen, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you next episode. Thanks again, everyone.